opening the door for a flexible development plan. This knight sidesteps immediate confrontation, asserting central presence immediately. d5 grabs space and invites a pawn clash that could define the early battle. Challenging black's central grip, this pawn thrust immediately contests space and invites tactical complications. Boldly seizing central space, black creates an immediate pawn chain, limiting white's knight development and demanding a response. Opening up lines for the bishop, this pawn push aims to solidify central influence and prepare for queenside development. Developing the knight here supports the pawn chain and prepares for potential kingside activity. Capturing the pawn instantly resolves central tension, creating an open position where piece activity will be paramount for white's initiative. Reclaiming the pawn immediately ignites central tension, but be mindful of potential knight repositioning and pawn structure weaknesses that might arise. Simplifying the central pawn structure often favors the side with better piece mobility, which looks promising here for white's development. Recapturing the pawn instantly shifts the dynamic, bringing black's queen into an active central position, ready to exploit any forward pawn weaknesses. Developing a knight to c3 now aims to contest central squares, potentially challenging black's queen and opening up lines for further piece activity, while simultaneously reinforcing the d4 pawn if it were to be attacked again. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, this move aims to support the d4 pawn and open a diagonal for the queen, simultaneously preparing for a kingside castling maneuver. It's a cautious but sound development, building a robust defensive setup. Fortifying the center and opening a diagonal for the bishop, this maneuver aims to establish solid pawn control, potentially limiting black's queen's activity while preparing for a more active piece development. In the coming stages, launching the knight to the edge of the board offers little immediate impact and risks its displacement later. Consider rerouting it toward the central action or prioritizing pawn advancements to solidify your structure. Developing the bishop here * opens lines for the queen * and * prepares kingside castling, while also * challenging black's central pawn, hinting at a potential struggle for * control of the d4 square. Repositioning the queen to d8 seems like a prudent retreat, acknowledging the earlier skirmish on d4 left her exposed, and now subtly prepares to contest control of the central dark squares, perhaps with an eye towards a later e5 push or simply to connect the rooks more effectively in the future. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn on h6 is a bold decision. It aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially expose the castled king later on, although it does temporarily give up piece activity for positional gain. Opening the g-file might seem attractive for bringing the rook into play, but it significantly weakens your kingside structure, leaving the king exposed to potential attacks down that newly opened diagonal. This pawn structure sacrifice, while creating some attacking potential, also invites white to exploit the weakened squares around your monarch. Reclaiming the center, white boldly stakes a claim in the heart of the board, creating a potent pawn chain and challenging black's somewhat fragmented piece development. Developing the bishop to g7, black aims to neutralize white's imposing central pawn structure and prepare for kingside castling, while simultaneously creating a potentially disruptive battery along the a1-h8 diagonal targeting white's relatively exposed king. Pushing the pawn forward claims crucial central territory and opens a diagonal for the queen, while simultaneously restricting black's knight development and creating attacking possibilities on the kingside. A delicate repositioning, the queen gracefully retreats to d6, seeking refuge from the advancing pawn and preparing to potentially redeploy to a more active square. Perhaps eyeing the kingside or supporting a queenside buildup. Establishing dominion over the c-file heralds a proactive stance, aiming to leverage the open column for future incursions and pressure. Unleashing the queen to g6. Black seeks to disrupt white's burgeoning pawn center and perhaps prepare a counter-thrust on the kingside, though the misplaced queen could become a target. A swift redeployment of the queen to a more active square, aiming to leverage the open d-file and potentially pressure black's somewhat exposed kingside pawns. The queen embarks on a bold, though perhaps premature, foray, seeking to establish a commanding presence on the kingside. However, this aggressive deployment sacrifices valuable tempo and neglects the critical pawn structure of the queenside, potentially leaving it vulnerable to further encroachment. Repositioning the queen from its exposed central position to a more defensive square on the third rank subtly reinforces the central pawn structure while preparing for potential kingside operations. The bishop slides to e5, initiating a delicate balancing act. Black aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially exploit the now weakened light squares around the king. Observe how this square addition contributes to the ever-present tension on the d-file, creating a dynamic battleground for piece activity. Trading queens now simplifies the position significantly, transforming it into a strategic battleground where white will aim to leverage their superior pawn structure and central control. Reshaping the pawn structure after the queen exchange creates a somewhat isolated king's pawn for black, but opens the h-file, which could become a factor later. The bishop lands on d3, solidifying control over the important central squares and preparing to join the attack on the kingside after recapturing the pawn on d5. Opening the c-file for your rook and freeing your pieces from their initial cramped positions forms the immediate tactical justification, yet the underlying positional consequence is far more significant. By capturing the pawn, you're not just resolving an immediate material standoff. You're beginning a slow but deliberate process of unraveling white's central pawn structure. This exchange, while seemingly simple, fundamentally alters the pawn dynamics, creating potential weaknesses around white's d-pawn which could be exploited later. The long-term vision here is to leverage this pawn structure imbalance for enduring positional advantage, aiming to achieve greater piece mobility and eventually control of key lines. Finally, resolving the central pawn struggle, white seizes the open c-file, immediately pressuring black's queenside and preparing to deploy rooks with purpose, potentially targeting the d5 pawn should black falter in its defense. Boldly challenging the central pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to contest the d5 outpost and prepare for potential counterplay. It signals black's intention to avoid passive defense and embrace a more dynamic struggle, even if it means accepting a somewhat compromised pawn formation. The bishop's new diagonal offers a broader scope of influence, potentially targeting white's queenside or even its king's defense in the long run. This is a move that requires careful calculation from white, as the bishop's placement can now disrupt white's developing plans and force tactical considerations. Castling achieves the primary goal of king safety, tucking your monarch away behind a protective pawn shield, while simultaneously activating your rook to the more central c-file, preparing for future struggles for control. Bringing the rook to the open c-file now creates immediate pressure, threatening to infiltrate white's territory and potentially establish a strong presence on the second rank, which could prove quite uncomfortable for the white king once castled. Unlocking a potent diagonal for the bishop and preparing to seize the initiative on the kingside. This knight repositioning introduces a dynamic threat. Reclaiming that central pawn with the rook immediately disrupts white's nascent queenside pressure and aims to neutralize the open c-file, a potentially crucial corridor for white's rooks in the coming endgame. The rerouting of the rook to the first rank immediately secures control of the open file, a crucial element for future operations and a foundation for initiating an endgame if the opportunity arises. Black's focus now shifts to solidifying the kingside pawn structure after the capture of the g-pawn, seeking to prevent white from exploiting weaknesses on that flank, while simultaneously preparing for a potential minority attack or pawn break on the queenside. Solidifying the queenside structure. This pawn advance aims to restrict Black's bishop and prepare a potential expansion on the queenside, perhaps with a subsequent a4 and b4 maneuver. Unleashing an ambitious pawn thrust, Black seeks to seize the initiative on the kingside and disrupt white's pawn structure, though this aggressive advance simultaneously exposes the king to potential future attacks and may overextend Black's forces. Reclaiming a central outpost for the knight offers white a chance to improve coordination and prepare for potential pawn advances, aiming to exploit the slightly weakened kingside structure after Black's pawn pushes. Unburdening the king from its central anchoring allows it to seek refuge and potentially participate in the coming skirmishes, a stark contrast to the cramped situation it endured. The knight hops to the queenside, aiming to exploit the open b-file and pressure Black's slightly exposed pawn structure, potentially creating imbalances for a later queenside initiative. Relocating the rook to the open a-file offers immediate activity, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create counterplay along the first rank. Fortifying that open file now offers vital protection to the king and prepares for a potential pawn push on the queenside, while simultaneously restricting Black's bishop from dominating from its current diagonal. The knight's foray to a6 immediately challenges white's bishop, forcing a decision and potentially simplifying the position, while simultaneously aiming to secure better outpost squares for Black's pieces as the queens are traded off. Reclaiming central space and preparing to occupy the open c-file. This knight maneuvers to a more active outpost, disrupting Black's defensive structure. Asserting control over the c-file is paramount, and this timely occupation of the open column directly challenges white's rook, forcing a decision about its future placement and potentially limiting its offensive capabilities. On the queenside, shifting the knight to e6 opens a crucial diagonal for the bishop and potentially forces concessions from Black's overextended pawn structure, aiming to exploit the king's exposed position. The king's sudden journey to f6 opens a surprisingly active diagonal for the queen and hints at a potential regrouping, though it exposes the monarch to the lurking knight on e6 and the bishop potentially swinging to b5. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure and preparing for a potential pawn storm or creating a safe haven for the king later. Acknowledging the immediate threat to the rook on c2. This capture, while seemingly forced, initiates a starkly simplified endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside may prove decisive, opening the c-file for potential pressure against the kingside. This recapture solidifies white's pawn structure and begins the process of clearing lines for future piece activity. Finally, Black addresses the pawn chain's left flank, aiming to solidify that section of the board after a series of aggressive exchanges. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal. This bishop retreat aims to improve white's positional grip, eyeing the weakened kingside and potentially supporting a kingside advance later on. Seeking to activate the bishop, black repositions the piece to c8, eyeing the b7 pawn and hoping to contribute to kingside defense. A rather passive attempt at development given the precarious pawn structure and white's active pieces. Striking at the center with pawn advances often leads to dynamic imbalances. And here, f4 aims to seize more central space and potentially open lines for white's pieces. Black's pawn structure on the kingside has been weakened by the capture on h6, making this central push a strategic gamble that could lead to exciting complications. Embracing the pawn structure, this capture unravels the central tension, opening the g-file for white's rook and potentially creating attacking avenues. Repositioning the knight to create an attacking wedge aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and control the center more effectively. Bringing the bishop to the flank opens up its diagonal, eyeing the potentially weakened kingside pawns and seeking to disrupt white's centralized control. Repositioning the king to a more central square improves its defensive capabilities and prepares it for potential endgame action, while simultaneously clearing the f-file for future piece activity. Shifting the bishop to d6, black subtly aims to increase pressure along the dark squares and prepare for a potential pawn push. On f5, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain more active piece play. Shifting the monarch allows for improved defensive coverage of the central pawns. Anticipating potential infiltration from the black bishop. Re-establishing pressure on the queenside by bringing the bishop back to a more active diagonal. Aims to challenge white's control over the a3-f8 diagonal and prepare for potential pawn pushes in that sector, even though it momentarily abandons the defense of the kingside. The monarch's journey towards the center signals an endgame transition, aiming to leverage the king's newfound mobility in the simplified position, though it potentially exposes him to future discovered attacks if black can create counterplay on the open files. The bishop's retreat to c8 fundamentally alters the dynamic, sacrificing its attacking potential for a more defensive posture, and aims to reinforce the e6 pawn should it become a target for white's now well-placed knight. A subtle repositioning of the bishop aims to reroute it towards the queenside, potentially eyeing weakened squares or supporting a future pawn advance. A bold attempt to disrupt white's seemingly solid setup, venturing the king into the fray. Aimed at activating the bishop and challenging black's increasingly cramped kingside pawn structure. This maneuver seeks to exploit the open diagonal for potential pressure on the f-file and a re-evaluation of piece placement. Discovering a new diagonal for the bishop, this unexpected royal check probes white's king and forces an immediate repositioning, potentially disrupting white's recently solidified pawn structure and challenging the coordination of their pieces. Securing the king's advance towards the center is crucial here, as it can soon become an active participant in the game, potentially challenging black's central control and aiding the development of remaining pieces. Sacrificing the bishop here unravels black's structure further, surrendering the crucial diagonal that could have defended against white's advancing kingside pawns, and creating a permanent outpost for the white knight on f4. Gaining control of the open g-file with the pawn now provides an immediate advantage, opening lines for your rook to potentially join the attack or secure better defense. The black king, having boldly ventured into the enemy's territory, now faces a crucial decision on where to anchor itself, lest it become a perpetual target for white's still potent pieces. Re-establishing a defensive post, the bishop aims to reinforce the weakened kingside pawns and potentially find more active squares. Later, expanding the queenside pawn structure provides an immediate pawn majority and potential for creating a passed pawn. But it also neglects central control and could weaken the king's defenses if not handled carefully. Unlocking the king from its pawn shield offers a dynamic counterplay, aiming to exploit black's potentially exposed monarch in the ensuing race for the center. Repositioning the bishop to the queenside offers a chance to contest control of the a-file and potentially support a pawn advance further down the board. Opening that queenside pawns creates new avenues for attack and potential weaknesses on that flank. The king's newfound central influence on c3, after a lengthy sojourn on the queenside and then the kingside, offers a potent threat, aiming to disrupt the white pawn structure and seize control of vital central squares. The king is now actively participating in the battle, eyeing the open files for potential breakthroughs and seeking to support its advancing pawns. The bishop on e8 is bravely venturing towards the kingside, seeking to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and potentially participate in an attack. But it risks being outmaneuvered if white can consolidate and create a blockade, initiating a crucial defensive maneuver. The bishop slides to a square that shores up the king's escape route and simultaneously prepares to contest the central dark squares, vital for preventing further black incursions. Finally, black's bishop finds a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened queenside pawns and potentially supporting a future advance. Dislodging that excellent bishop outpost on h5 is a priority, aiming to regain some dynamic piece activity. Unlocking the potential of the light-squared bishop suddenly becomes paramount, as it now exerts influence on the crucial central squares and targets the weak pawns on white's kingside. Sensing an opportunity to solidify the pawn structure and restrict black's bishop, this move aims to create a more favorable endgame scenario. The bishop's retreat aims to reposition it to a more active diagonal and potentially prepare for further pawn advances, but it relinquishes control of the c1h6 diagonal, a key pathway for white's remaining pieces. The bishop now finds a new post, aiming to control the dark squares from a safer distance and potentially support a pawn advance later, hoping to reroute the bishop to a more active square. This maneuver aims to reposition the piece from its current passive role. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the queenside is paramount now, aiming to prevent black's king from finding a safe haven and potentially creating a passed pawn. A dynamic pawn structure has emerged, and now black's bishop seeks to exploit it by reinforcing its influence on the kingside. Exploring the subtle dance around the central dark squares, this maneuver by the bishop aims to reposition and potentially support a pawn advance, though it offers little immediate tactical disruption and allows black to continue their patient consolidation. The bishop's flight to a new diagonal finally forces the queen's pawn to advance, opening lines that might have been more strategically beneficial earlier. Capturing the bishop firmly establishes white's king as a menacing attacking force, its centralized position promising an active role in the unfolding pawn struggle and potentially creating breakthroughs that were previously unavailable. The king's venturing into the enemy territory, though bold, now faces a precarious dance with the opposing bishop, potentially overextending its reach and creating vulnerabilities as the pawn structure remains solid.